Yeah. Hello, everyone. You can see my screen, I guess. Just a quick word about me. I'm Lene, a web developer living in Madrid, and I enjoy building fast and usable websites with semantic HTML and modern CSS and as few JavaScript as possible. Logically, Eleventy is my tool of choice as it has no client-side JavaScript dependencies. When I started working with Eleventy a few years ago, I honestly didn't understand much. Basically, because I didn't understand much JavaScript. I tried out some templates, so-called starter projects. One of the first ones I used was called Eleventy template, a starter with Tailwind, which had a lot of things already pre-configured. I did not know what was going on in that config file, and I didn't dare to change anything that was already there. Instead, I added stuff somewhere in between. Soon enough, my Eleventy config file became overwhelming and incomprehensible. I'm showing still the original config file from the template, by the way. I wouldn't dare showing you my messy old files. Anyway, I was determined to change this condition. I'm a big fan of structure and maintainability, especially with file systems, and I wanted to know what's going on. Reading the Eleventy documentation is always a good idea and a good place to start. There's a big chapter all around configuration options. To work well with Eleventy, you will deal with callback functions, loop over object keys and values, and use the CommonJS standard of Node to define dependencies and modules. If you're new to JavaScript, or like me, in a state in which JavaScript never seems to become second nature, these concepts sound a little scary. What you see on screen is a callback function. It exports the Eleventy configuration settings. Don't worry, I won't try and explain callback functions now. Just know that they are everywhere as you go and expand your configuration, and it really makes sense understanding them. These are some basic contents of the config file, where I'm for now just defining that source will be my input directory and dist will be my output directory. I won't show this part in later examples, but imagine that I always put it at the very end of the config file. The function we export takes a single parameter, which is the Eleventy config object. We are calling the parameter usually Eleventy config, but you might see examples where it's just called config. You can call it whatever you like, which is a recurring feature of Eleventy, all the freedom in the world. When we run the Eleventy build process, Eleventy will call that function and use the configuration settings we defined to generate our site. We are essentially calling back to the Eleventy configuration API to configure our site generation process. The configuration API includes a variety of methods and properties, so we can configure and customize Eleventy's behavior. I'm showing a screenshot of the user config class in Eleventy core, where that API is being defined. Today, I want to talk about organizing the configuration file. And to show some ways to do that, I picked the addFilter method to define custom filters for our templates. And later on, the addPassthroughCopy method to copy static assets from our input directory to our output directory. Normally, you don't have to check this core Eleventy file. The documentation covers all that. But as you will notice, I like to look into code. It really helps me understand everything better. Let's look at a small filter we'd like to use in our project. We put in 2 arguments. The name of the filter, I call it uppercase, and a function that returns the string that's being set to uppercase with JavaScript. We can then go on and use our filter with the template language of our choice. In this case, I'm showing a syntax that is valid liquid in Nunjax code. Looking at the config file from my starter template back then, I understood that the developer had moved all filters into a file called filters.js, placed in the root of the project in a folder called utils. So what's going on here? First, we import or require our external filters.js file. This is what the filters.js file looks like. We have created an object literal with key value pairs. I highlighted the keys or filter names. We use JavaScript's own object keys method on that object to loop over all the filter names. Our addFilter helper method is then applied to each filter name. So all the JavaScript code I perceived as untidy lives inside a utils folder. in a file called filters.js, nicely packed away. I was convinced that's how I wanted my whole config file to be like. And if I did have to change something in the filters, I would just go to the specific file for that. What I never really liked about this method, though, was that I couldn't see which filters were available to me right in the Eleventy config file, just that there were filters. So I would have to visit those external files more often than I wanted. It was a revelation when I looked into Alexander's source code one day. I always do this when I'm on a personal website, especially if I know it's an Eleventy site. I look for that GitHub link and hope it leads me to the source code. I've learned something new every time I did this. In this case, I discovered what would be the basis for organizing all my config files from that moment on. Just look at that. So well arranged and readable. Let's see what's going on here. Alexander has also outsourced his filters. It's a little less concise, but I can see exactly which filters are available for me to use right inside the Eleventy config file. Alexander organizes all his collections, shortcodes, filters, and so on in a folder called config in the root of his project. I have adopted this habit instantly, as the name seems much more intuitive to me than utils. The filters are exported and individually imported or required in the config file, where we can also rename them for further use in the project. If this nesting level is enough for you, you can put your filters directly into a filter.js file inside the config folder. And here's that filters.js file. Named exports can be exported individually or batched together and exported at the bottom of the module. Exporting everything at the bottom, like in this example here, is much cleaner according to my taste, so I favor this method. In this case, our filters are very short and clear, and I don't need to outsource each filter to a separate file. But if the code is too complex, and I'm always doing that, that might be overly specific, but I create a separate clearly named folder and an index.js for every exported function. The exported values are then imported into the parent folder's index.js and then exported all together again for the Eleventy config file. I think you get the idea. You don't have to take it that far, of course, but for me, this particular nesting system works. I don't want to relocate the disorganization. I want to solve it in the long run. There's yet another way to address the problem of importing larger blocks of code. If you take a look at the config file of the Eleventy base block, you will see that 2 additional config files are pulled in using the add plugin method. Note that since Eleventy 2.0, the config file can also be called eleventy.config.js. The 2 config files are located in the root next to the main config file. The great thing about this approach is that I don't have to rewrite any code. I can take it out directly out of my config file. The syntax is exactly the same as in the main file. Some of my old messy config files are still in production, and when I get around to cleaning them up, it's done pretty quickly, thanks to this idea. Of course, you can also put the code block in the config folder we have used until now. The file does not have to be called eleventy.config something. It's all a matter of your own preferences and which system and naming conventions make the most sense to you. Now that we have all our filters neatly packed away, let's look at one more method you may want to include in your config file. It is a method that allows you to clean up your project even more efficiently. Sometimes we just want to copy files over to our output folder without subjecting them to further transformation processes, exactly as they are. These are any static assets you might have, for example, audio files, font files, or fav icons. I usually have several file types collected in my assets directory that I want to deal with in the same way. We use the addPassthroughCopy method I mentioned before. You can create those copies individually, and it really looks very clear and easy to read. Note that I usually put my images, CSS, and JavaScript in the assets directory as well, and they usually receive some kind of processing before being placed in the output folder. If that wasn't the case, I could just copy the whole assets folder. Anyway, if you want to reduce the syntax, JavaScript offers the possibility to combine them. We can put all directories into an array and apply the for each method to execute the copy method once for each array element. That's really a matter of taste again. You also may want to copy your files to another directory, like any static file that must or should be placed in the project root of your output folder, but you don't want to see it in your input folder. Here's how to do that. Instead of a string, you pass in an object with an input target structure. Here I apply this to our favicon example. Again, I could do this for every file separately, but in this case, this really would be repetition, which does not contain any meaningful info to me, but just clutters up my config file. Instead, I select all the files in the directory with the asterisk wildcard and send them to the project root. Many variations are possible here. You could address any JPEG image in any directory and send them all together to a common output folder. So that's how I'm structuring my config files. I'm quite happy with that approach for the moment. No matter how big the project threatens to become, I don't lose control of it. And hopefully developers who come after me will also be able to understand everything. What I consider most important is spending a lot of time in the code of other Eleventy projects. None of the approaches I showed you, I have figured out myself. I discovered them all in other repositories or the Eleventy documentation. What remains for me to say is Eleventy is great. Thank you so much, Zach. And thank you, all of you, for the great resources you create, starters, plugins, for all those articles you publish, and the code of your projects that you make freely available. This really is an incredible community. Thank you.